So many of you know Ray Young, who's our Division Chief for Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and also the Interim Chief for Rheumatology. And he's going to introduce our esteemed speaker, named for one of our esteemed faculty members. So, Ray?
Thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. And today we are actually also doing the Alan Dengiz MD lectureship. So I want to just very briefly say something about Alan, who's actually sitting here with us, with his wife, Lisa. So Alan is truly a Michigan man. He was born in this city here, and I think in the building where my office is, on the 9th floor of the NIB building. And he completed the medical school training as well as the internal medicine residency here at Michigan. And then he became a chief medical resident under Bill Kelly's at the time. And he was very much involved and intimately involved with the early days when the geriatrics medicine program was first established here by Ivan Dove here in Michigan. And that's also where his wife, Lisa, was there to help started the program there as a social worker. And together they also helped help Alan decided that geriatric medicine is really the pathway that he should be pursuing. And Alan was also briefly the acting chief of the division at the time and the director of the Turner Geriatrics Clinic. He also helped recruited my predecessor, Dr. Jeff Horter, who was here for 27, 28 years before he retired a few years ago. And then Alan decided that he wanted to also have his impact out in the community and went into work with St. Joe's and that group for a while, where he really established the geriatric medicine program there and really became very much involved in the community over there. And that really is kind of what Alan has been and is the kind of physician that is well loved and beloved by the communities and everyone he knows. And his patients are all incredibly sad when he retired. And I got a earful certainly from a lot of patients about his retirement and when he stopped working. But Alan has always been also part of the community in many, many ways and contributed to the city of Ann Arbor and surrounding communities a lot. He was a founding member of the Burns Park Players, one of Ann Arbor's most beloved theater programs, and the group has helped raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for art programs in the local communities over the years. So when he retired, we thought it would be important to recognize Alan's contribution to the University of Michigan for Michigan medicine as well as to the community. And so we established this lectureship and with the support from many of his friends and patients. So we are delighted to have invited Dr. Bruce Left to come to be the inaugural speaker here. The lecture, we had one about 2 years ago as a kind of starting point, and we decided that would be a great place to have the lectureship is with the medicine grand rounds to reach a wider audience. So a few words about Bruce. Dr. Bruce Left did his medical training, MD training in NYU and really stayed in the East Coast. He then did his internal medicine residency and geriatric medicine fellowship under John Burton, a really prominent geriatrician at Hopkins. And he had really stayed his entire professional career at Hopkins, and is current professor of medicine with joint appointments in the schools of public health and the schools of nursing. He's the director of the Center for Transformative Geriatric Research, and the center's research focuses on novel models of care for older adults, which is something that geriatricians always are looking for, models of care that can improve outcome and at the same time able to reduce the cost of care. And also interested in issues related to multi-comorbidities, performance measurements, and case mix issues. And Bruce is also a clinician who cares deeply for his patient. He cares for patients in both the acute, ambulatory, and home setting, and is really an award-winning teacher and mentor at Hopkins, where he also directs the medicine clerkship at the School of Medicine. Nationally, he currently serves as the chair of the Geriatric Medicine Board of the American Board of Internal Medicine, ABIM, and is chair-elect of the ABIM Council. He's also the past president of the American Academy of Home Care Physicians and was on the Board of Regents of the American College of Physicians, and he serves on the editorial board of the Annals of Internal Medicine. He has won many, many awards for his work that he has done, his research and contribution, including the prestigious 2018 American Geriatric Society Henderson's Award, where I have heard him spoke passionate about the topic that he will be talking about. Some of you may have already seen some of his work, and there was a New England Journal of Medicine piece in 2017 entitled Why I Believe in Hospital at Home, which is really what he's passionate about. And there's a quote in the article that I read up today from a patient in Baltimore talking about the Baltimore hospital there, and said, "Doc, you guys are wonderful, but you won a crappy hotel." And so that was the quote, and so I want please join me and welcome Dr. Left. And Alan, you want to come down here? Just want to have you present Dr. Left with the Alan N. Dengiz, MD, Lectureship 2019. Great, thank you. Just present it to you.
Thank you.
Great honor. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you very much.
All right. Everyone can hear me in the back? Okay. It is great to be here in Ann Arbor. It's the first time I've ever been here. I hope it's not the last. Of note, my daughter got into the law school here recently, so she may be here in September. If so, I'll be visiting a bit more often. We'll see where she chooses to go. But I am so honored to be giving this lecture and very honored to have Alan and his wife here to watch. That's great. So happy Ides of March. You know, that's not a really good omen of a day to be giving a lecture. For those young ones in the audience who never read Shakespeare, that is the day that Caesar got stabbed in the back. So I'm hoping not to buy that kind of accolade today. A few disclosures, any of which I'm happy to discuss at the end of the discussion. So I'm going to start with the end in mind. This is the thesis that I'd like to try and convince you of, and that is that home-based medical care will ultimately be mainstreamed into the U.S. healthcare delivery system. I don't know what the lag is on that, but I am pretty sure that's going to happen, and I'd like to make that argument today. And I have to say, when I found out that I was giving this lecture, I went online, put Alan's name into Google, and it's just amazing what you can learn about anyone with Google. And this is Alan in a 1 and 56-second video talking about how he got into geriatrics, how he developed that interest. And I was so gratified to hear him talk about how making house calls was so influential for him. And of course, like every successful gentleman, there is a woman standing by his side. She was the one who pushed him to do that. And for me, the reason it echoed for me was that, I'm sorry, I'm getting over a bit of a cold. The thing that got me interested in geriatrics and in home-based medicine was actually going out and making house calls. So I trained in the primary care internal medicine program at Hopkins Bayview, which was the old Baltimore City hospitals. The city sold the hospital to Hopkins for $1 in the mid-1980s. It was always Hopkins faculty, but they wanted to get out of the hospital business, turned it back to Hopkins, and this is where the primary care program was based. And as a second-year general medicine resident, one of our additional ambulatory experiences was to pick up a longitudinal practice of folks who were homebound, and we made house calls to them in their home. And for me, this was a transformational experience. So I see a bunch of trainees in the white coats. How many of you have actually made a house call? So for me, that was utterly transformational. And this is one of the first papers I ever wrote based on that experience. And I talk about going out into the Baltimore heat of summer, making house calls to homes without air conditioning, and finding people who were so homebound they could not access primary care, and how that changed me as a physician, and how I had to become much better at communication, how my physical exam had to be taken up several notches because the echocardiogram wasn't immediately available, how I had to learn how to better develop diagnostic and therapeutic plans that matched the social needs of my patients and their ability to do things and their desires to engage in certain kinds of medical workups. So for me, that was absolutely transformational. And that got me to think about, well, what is this home-based care kind of thing? And so, like any good person, I went to the literature. And the literature in home care and home-based care was a mess. And it took me a few years to figure this out. So this is a mental map that I came up with to help me think about what goes on outside, these big buildings that we spend much of our life in. And I'm going to try and transmit that mental map to you. It may actually help you just a little bit. So over here on the left, we have what I'll call informal services. So I'm married, and I can't take a bath anymore by myself. My wife, who I hope will still love me in another 30 years, I hope she will help me take a bath. That's informal care. I'm probably not going to pay her for that. She's going to do that hopefully out of love. Or hopefully my daughters will do that for me. By the way, what is the best long-term care insurance policy in America? Daughters. Sons are relatively worthless when it comes to this kind of thing. And I say that as a son who could be a much better son. Now, probably about 10 or 15 million people are getting that kind of care. Basically, that care is provided to society, at no economic charge to the government. And it's a low acuity thing. Now, let's say my wife doesn't like me anymore, won't do it, or she's too infirm and can't do it. I can pay someone to come to my home and give me that bath or help cook a meal for me. And that's not the easiest kind of service to purchase. Usually you have to buy that care in about 4-hour blocks of time in most places, anywhere from $25 to $50 an hour. Not the easiest thing to find. Probably about 2 million people are getting that. A little further to the right, we have skilled home health care, right? So the house staff, right? You want to get someone out of the hospital, you talk to the case manager, and you say, that person needs to go home with skilled home health care. Or you're just saying home care. But that's a very special thing, skilled home health care. It's a Medicare benefit, actually under Part A Medicare. So remember, Part A Medicare pays for inpatient service and it pays for skilled home health care. To get skilled home health care, I need to have what Medicare calls a skilled need. That is something that a skilled person does. So you don't need a skill, in theory, according to Medicare, to give someone a bath. But who are skilled people? A nurse is a skilled person. Physical therapist is a skilled person. An occupational therapist is a skilled person. Medicare will pay for that care in 60-day prospectively paid episodes of care. They can be renewed. As long as I have that skilled need, Medicare will also pay for someone to come out and give me a bath. But as soon as that skilled need goes away, as soon as I, say, plateau in therapy, the nurse leaves, the episode is closed, no more bath giving for me, and I start to get smelly and dirty. Okay? Moving over a little further to the right, we have home-based primary care, which I'll talk about. That's basically what I was doing as a second and third year resident, going out to folks' homes who were homebound, providing medical care on a longitudinal basis. Those are billed under Medicare Part B the same way you bill for clinic visits. around here. And probably about 500,000 people are getting that in the US. And then further to the right is more of a model that's not yet ubiquitous, but hospital at home. So actually providing acute hospital-level care in the home as a full substitute for doing it in the hospital, and I'll talk about that. So as you go from left to right, you're moving from low acuity to high acuity, you're moving from chronic constructs of care towards a more acute and longitudinal constructs of care, and you're moving from models with little or no physician involvement to models with higher levels of physician involvement. So that's one mental map you can sort of start to think about in your head. But things get more complicated, and it's gotten much more complicated in the last 5 years. A lot of disruption is happening in this space, and I use disruption actually in a very positive sense, I think. So there are opportunities here for innovation, for money, for economic success. So what do you have? We had home-based primary care. In the last few years, you've seen home-based palliative care develop. So often an entity will have a risk contract with a managed care group and try and manage the palliative care needs at home for people who are suffering, say, with cancer. And you may have heard of the company Aspire that was recently bought out for several $100 million doing exactly that kind of care. And that company basically poached a lot of palliative medicine faculty from around the country to staff their company. You have a whole lot of transitional and post-acute care transitions programs. You can now get urgent care at home or on the phone. So several companies now that if you're at home, not necessarily targeted towards older adults, you're at home, you think you have a strep throat, press a button on your phone, you'll get a televisit with a doc, and they'll prescribe an antibiotic for you. Or you can press another button while in that app and say, come over and make a house call and bring my flu shot when you come out with me. Okay? A convenience service. You have EMS-based models, so a lot of community paramedic programs getting into the mix. So in San Diego, their community paramedics are acting as case managers for people who are living on the street. Think about it. So a paramedic is a case manager. Think about how all these things are getting blended together. You also have what I'll call formal personal care plus kinds of services. So there's a model that a brilliant colleague of mine at Hopkins developed, a woman named Sarah Zanton, and the model is called Capable. Particularly relevant to Michigan because it's now being implemented at scale, I think through Blue Cross Blue Shield. So it's a time-limited intervention of a nurse, an OT, and a handyman. Right? Whenever I say handyman, like, right? Because that's pretty innovative, right? A handyman. It's targeted, and this is a really innovative piece. People living in the community, dually eligible, so Medicare and Medicaid eligible, which is the sickest population out there. Multiple chronic conditions, per average year cost probably in the $40,000 or $50,000 range, with functional impairment. And Sarah said, I'm going to send out an OT, nurse, and handyman, and I'm going to improve function, ADLs, activities of daily living, which is incredible because almost nothing has been shown to improve functional status in functionally impaired community dwelling older adults. And the real special sauce is she's been able to teach her staff how to truly elicit patient goals, which is something that we think we do a fair bit, but we generally don't do it terribly well, myself included. So, go out to the home, patient's goal, I want to be able to walk out to my mailbox. The handyman doesn't fix the whole house, but puts in a rail so that someone can go down 3 steps and get to the mailbox. And it's shown that you can improve functional status and reduce costs for both Medicare and Medicaid. That's pretty impressive. And then there's been a ton on telemedicine and sensor technology, and just as a global comment would say, that's coming. Most of the back-end stuff, the algorithms, are not quite there yet, but that'll come. So that's the map. This is the disrupted map. And what I want to do now is tell you just a little bit about homebound people in general. So Till about 3 or 4 years ago, there were really no good data on exactly how many older adults were homebound. Most papers would toss out a number of 4 or 5 million and would reference census data. And whenever I tried to dig into that, you can never actually find that. So it was kind of a made-up number. Fortunately, recently, there have been some data sets that help us get a slightly clearer picture of this. So these are data from NHATS, the National Health and Aging Trend Study. It's an epidemiologic study. Great population weights, so you can generalize to the population. In that paper were several questions that let us make assumptions about how homebound someone was. So in the upper left here, we have what I'll call totally homebound. These are people who say, over the last month, I never went out of my house. And that's about 400,000 people. And then you have mostly homebound people, people who rarely go out, about 1.6 million people over the age of 65. So it's about 2 million who are mostly or completely homebound. Then you have these other categories, people who go out some days, people who go out most days, and people who go out every day. The really interesting thing is that even within these categories where people are getting out, a lot of people need help, never go out by themselves, or have difficulty. So think about 2 million people or so who are completely or mostly homebound, and about another 4.5 million who are what I would call semi-homebound. A lot of homebound folks out there. Difficult for them to access care. And these folks are different from you and me. Okay? So, lower educational attainment, less likely to be married, more likely to be poor, more likely to have poor self-rated health, more likely to be depressed or demented, less likely to be able to walk any distance, and much more likely to be hospitalized. So this is the high need, high cost, functionally impaired group, often with limited social capital. So think about that population. Think about the spectrum of home-based services. What I want to do now is just concentrate a little bit on this block here, this home-based primary care block. So this is a picture of a good friend and colleague, Eric DeYoung. So Eric was a trainee of mine, a fellow of mine at Hopkins, and then Eric decided, as some of you probably will in the future, he decided to test the hypothesis that it was probably be better to be from Hopkins than at Hopkins. So he left Hopkins and he went down to the Washington Hospital Center and started a home-based primary care practice. And it turned out to be a very innovative practice, and it served as a model for other practices, and it's also been very influential in policy circles because it's in D.C., so we can get senators and congressmen to come on visits, and that usually opens up their eyes. So the issue here is that home-based primary care, if you're doing it well, you really create a village around the people with a whole bunch of different kinds of services. It's interdisciplinary care. These are practices that are not in the body part business. Okay, they don't see just the heart or lungs, and with all due respect to my cardiologists and pulmonary medicine specialists, they really see the patient as a whole because these people never have just one thing. They have multiple things and functional impairment. That makes a big difference. So Eric established a practice like this. There are many practices like this now, not enough. And if you look at the effects of this kind of care on these kinds of populations, it's really pretty dramatic. So these are data from a systematic review of 9 studies that have been published, 9 high-quality studies. And you see patients who get this kind of care, 15% reduction in ED visits, 30% reduction in hospital admissions, 45% reduction in hospital bed days of care. One study looked at long-term care admissions, a VA study, 15% reduction with an 88% reduction in long-term care bed days of care. Costs lower, better satisfaction in caregiver quality of life. And they thought that the components that made a difference in a qualitative sense were the fact that you had interdisciplinary teams providing care to people with functional impairment and also after-hours support. So the ability for someone in distress to call someone who knew them and say, go to the ED or don't go to the ED. So these practices have really been quite influential. And you might say, why does this work? So does anyone know who the guy on the left is? I thought I heard it. Say it? Who said it? It's a prize. All right, that's Willie Sutton. So the younger people in the group probably don't know who Willie Sutton was. Willie Sutton was a famous bank robber. Robbed a lot of banks in the Boston area in the 1950s and 1960s, I think. And one day he was walking out of court, and someone said to him, Willie, like, why do you rob banks? And Willie looked at them and said, like, are you idiots? He said, well, he supposedly said, that's where the money is. That's where the money is. So it's the notion, as a health services researcher, where I have failed many more times than I succeeded, I think it's critically important to line up three things. What is the targeted population you're going to focus on? What is the model or intervention you're going to use on that population? And what goal, what outcome are you really willing to live or die for? Right? If you want a model that reduces cost, you may design it differently than if you're okay with a model that simply makes a care experience better. When you line up all three of these things, it's like an old-time Vegas slot machine. 3 cherries, and you get the payout. When you don't align these things, you get much less of a payout, or could potentially just lose money and cause harm at the same time. As an example of this, in your backyard, there's a company called USMM, United States Medical Management. They're the largest home-based primary care company in the country. They operate across 10 states. They're based in Troy, Michigan. They have an average daily census of about 40,000 patients across 100-plus practices. Recently, they formed, as far as I know, the only home-based primary care only accountable care organization. That was the 4th most successful ACO in 2017. They saved Medicare over $45 million. Okay? And why? Because it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You can only save money on people who cost money. Right? And there are lots of studies. There's at least one really good study to suggest that about half of preventable costs in Medicare can be attributable to frail older adults. So if you want to save money, you need to go fishing in the right places. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk now about hospital at home. So this is Walter, and I'm a little mad at Ray because he stole one of my good lines when he talked about the crappy hotel line, which will come up in a minute. But this is Walter, and Julie, did you know Walter?
I've heard you talk about Walter.
Yeah, so Julie knows Walter. So Walter was a guy who lived in southeast Baltimore. And were any of you fans of The Wire on HBO? Yeah, that's the best thing that's ever been on television. If you've not watched, not just because it's Baltimore, but it's really a Dickens novel. Brilliantly written. The only reason I bring it up is Walter lived in the neighborhood where most of the second season of The Wire was filmed, around the shipyards. And Walter was an older guy who had worked at the Beth Steel plant, was in our house calls program, multiple chronic conditions, COPD, CHF, yada, 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 yada. We managed him at home. And despite our trying to do a good job of that, Walter would often end up in the hospital. And these were his gripes with the hospital. He would say, can't get my breathing treatments on time, so I end up on the vent. Said the food stinks. He was actually much more graphic than that. No one would talk to him, so it was pretty lonely. Once he says, I got confused and I got tied down. So he developed incident delirium and was physically restrained. He never forgot that. Talked about that till the end of his days. It was the most humiliating experience of his life. And I know this only happens in Baltimore, not here in Ann Arbor, but he would always come home with a completely new set of medicines. So it's for patients like Walter that we started to think, could we do something different? Could we take care of people who should be in the hospital? Can we do that at home? Because our point of view is that older adults in the hospital, it's a dangerous environment for them. Also, we have many patients who would just refuse to go to the hospital. And so we started to think about a different model, and this is where Ray stole my line. One time we were out making a house call to Walter. He had a community-acquired pneumonia. He was sick as stink. And we said, Walter, you got to go to the hospital. And he said, I am so sick of you geniuses from Hopkins. I'm just tired of you guys. This is your problem now. I'm not going anywhere. And, you're great docs, but you run a crappy hotel. You deal with it. So we had to deal with it. And we would do things like this, and we said, can't we do this in a more systematic way? So we started to think about hospital at home. Could we bring the hospital home to people? And this was the original construct. So someone is identified at a point of care, usually the emergency department. They're acutely ill. They meet admission standards for hospitalization for select conditions. I'll talk about that in a minute. They agree to treatment at home. We take them home, sometimes in an ambulance, sometimes not. We get them home and we provide the care. So you can do IV medicines at home, and x-rays at home, and echoes at home, and breathing treatments at home, and oxygen therapy at home, and nursing at home, and OT and PT and all those things. Do that, and then once they're better, discharge them. So this is a one-slide summary of about 10 years worth of work. So the first thing we did when we started this was who and what could we treat in hospital at home? And we relied a little bit on our clinical, this is what we think we could do as clinicians in the home, and what do we do next? Well, then we had to figure out eligibility criteria to choose the right patients for hospital at home. So when I started at Hopkins in 1994, just after getting out of the Army, I'd come to Hopkins, and my first day there, who's there to help me is Dr. Julie Bynum, who is sitting in the third row right here, who is now one of your faculty, when she was an Eager Beaver second-year medical student. And thank God Julie was there because she knew what to do with research. I was still learning. So we developed ways to choose the right patients for hospital at home. You don't want people who need to be in an intensive care unit. You don't want people who are of a high likelihood of decompensating. You don't want people who are going to need lots of consultants and lots of high-tech treatment. But that accounted for about a third of people being admitted with common conditions that we were going to treat in hospital at home, like pneumonia and heart failure and COPD and cellulitis and the like. We did some early acceptability studies, sort of our field of dreams studies. If we built it, would people actually want this kind of care? And we got signals that they would. We did some early pilot studies at Hopkins. It took us a year to get our first study through the IRB. My bet is at Michigan here, your IRBs are staffed with people who are hospital people. And they couldn't, at Hopkins, our hospital subspecialists could not imagine that anything that did not happen within the hospital was not the only way to take care of someone. But we got that through, did our early pilot work, and found that patients liked it, lower rates of complications, and it cost less. At that time, we had some early experiences with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, so the folks who administer the Medicare program. And we went to them and we said, we need a payment model for hospital at home. Because right then, and still to this day, although it may change very soon, there's no way to pay for hospital at home under fee-for-service Medicare. So I go to the hospital president and I say, hey, Mr. President, I have this great model. It's brilliant. Patients are going to start in your emergency room. Instead of going up to your hospital bed where you would have gotten payment based on a DRG, instead, I'm going to take them home. You're going to pay for a whole lot of care, and you're not going to get any reimbursement. And and that's when they look at me and they say, why we even let you walk around here any longer is really a surprise to us. So we went to CMS to try and get that payment model. They said no. This was in the late 90s, when you may remember, if you're of a certain age, that Hillary Clinton was in charge of reforming healthcare under her husband, President Clinton. But the thinking at CMS then was that by the year 2000, everyone will be in managed care, what we now call Medicare Advantage. That didn't quite happen, but now we're up to, about 37% of Medicare enrollees are in managed care. So we did a larger national demonstration study in Medicare Advantage plans at several places around the country. I'll give you those results in a moment. And then since that time, we've been working on dissemination activities. So this was the paper where we reported on our results from our national demonstration study done at 4 different managed care plans around the country. And what we found was that 61% of people chose hospital at home care when offered. That might not sound like a lot, but imagine you're an 80-year-old in the emergency department with pneumonia. The ED physician has said, sir, ma'am, you need to be admitted to the hospital. Then someone else comes up to you and says, sir, ma'am, hey, we can do you've never met us before. We can do your hospital care at home in a model you've never heard of by people you've never met. And this model is supported by your friendly managed care organization, which has only your best interests in mind. And by the way, please sign this 10-page single-space consent form because it's research. So even in that context, people signed up. When you run this as a program, you see enrollment rates as high as 95%, which is interesting. We had high-quality care by any quality metric you can imagine, fewer complications, so we had lower mortality rates. We had a 75% reduction in incident delirium, very important for older adults. Better patient and family experience, lower costs of care, less caregiver stress. And actually, this is something you'll relate to. What I've learned this morning, you would not imagine how much stress is associated with parking at hospitals. I understand that's a sore point here with staff. So we'll get you some hospital at home. Better functional outcomes and high provider satisfaction. When you look at the world literature on hospital at home, you'll find that it's actually one of the best studied models. Multiple systematic reviews, Cochrane meta-analyses, and the like. And when you look at that, what you find is a 21% in reduction in mortality in meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials at 6 months. Let me repeat that. Dead or alive at 6 months, 21% better outcome if you're taking care of at home. That's a number needed to treat of 50. Right? If that were a drug, like I would not be here. I'd be in the Caymans counting my money, right? That's a blockbuster drug. But health service delivery innovation is much harder than drug dissemination. So Walter loved the model. He felt he would have definitely ended up on the breathing machine. He got all this attention from the nurses. And, when he stayed at home, I didn't have to make one of the fellows take care of his cat, which was really good, too. So we've been trying since that time to move our model from research into practice. So this is, if you've never been to Baltimore, this is the original Hopkins Hospital building. When you walk through these doors, you'll see a 20-foot statue of Jesus Christ and a lot of flowers at his feet. And then this is these are the rooms where Osler wrote his great textbook of medicine in the late 19th century. So we've really been trying to move from the dome, which is our corporate symbol, the ivory tower, into practice. And what we've been doing in that context is we've been trying to broaden awareness and create interest in the model. We've been engaging in several dissemination paths and providing technical assistance, and we've helped to establish programs in the VA, in Medicare Advantage plans and the like. We've been doing a lot of work on payment and policy issues. And over time, we've been able to put a few dots on the map. It's not a lot, but it's much more than it was 25 years ago, and probably not as much as it will be 25 years from now. A lot of adoption in the VA, globally budgeted system, strong home-based primary care program on which you can build hospital at home, and a bunch of Medicare Advantage. Some of the more interesting recent developments is that we were able to partner with colleagues at Mount Sinai in New York and got a Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation demonstration grant and completed a study last September 2017 of hospital at home. And the idea here was to propose to CMS an innovative model, so hospital at home, and an innovative payment. So we propose a bundled payment for the acute care plus 30 days of aftercare. And we had a grant from the Hartford Foundation to evaluate that. And these are data we published recently in JAMA Internal Medicine. So like many hospital at home studies, you find the acute length of stay for the acute episode is a little bit lower than the hospital. We could talk about some reasons for that. Risk of readmissions cut in half, risk of ED visits cut in half, transfer to skilled nursing facilities much, much lower. We have a slightly higher rate of referrals to skilled home health care and a better caregiver experience, and again, reduced costs. So reaffirming data that we've seen in other studies. Probably one of the more interesting results of that demo was to start to expand our thinking about what hospital at home can be and what the model could look like. So originally it was the construct of acute care at home as a substitute for what happens in the hospital. But we started to think as we were facing some recruitment issues, when we put in our application for this demonstration study, Sinai did not have an observation unit. between the time that we put in the grant proposal, the demo proposal, and started the work, Sinai had built a huge OBS unit. So a lot of the folks who probably would have come to hospital at home got snared into the OBS unit and then got admitted, and it was very hard to intercept them and bring them back to hospital at home. So we started to think, well, why not do an OBS stay at home? And then if someone stays more than 2 midnights in your home OBS unit, you can convert them to a hospital at home admission. We also found that there were a bunch of folks showing up in the Sinai ED who were really palliative care patients, but no one had ever told them that, and who were coming in with acute illness. So we started to take these people, and we called that acute palliative care at home. And it was important to separate them in the analysis because you have different expectations of their outcome. So we would admit them into acute pal care at home. We would start to have those discussions. They would often get converted to hospice, and they would have the kind of end-of-life experience that you would hope they would have. We started to see hospital averse at home, so people who were actually too sick for our hospital at home criteria, but would absolutely refuse to go to the hospital, sometimes because they needed to take care of a spouse with dementia or just didn't want to be in the hospital at all, and we would take those into our hospital averse program at home, still our hospital at home, and we're able to do well for them. Sinai's opening PEDS hospital at home. And then we started to think about, well, you have this competency, this verb, providing otherwise facility-based care in the home. Use it for other things. So we started to do rehab at home. People who have completed a hospital stay, they're slated to go to a skilled nursing facility for a rehab-heavy admission to a SNF, take them home, do their OT and PT at home. Everyone wanted that. Like 95% uptake. It was hard to find a comparison group to do work on that. This is all built on, at Sinai, a home-based primary care competency and this acute care competency. So the goal now to mainstream and scale home-based medical care. I'm going to focus mostly here on hospital at home as opposed to home-based primary care just for the sake of time. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with literature on dissemination of innovation. One of the core texts is from a gentleman named Everett Rogers who did his work with Iowa farmers and their propensity to adopt new techniques in seed. And he identified, his work is summarized in these few bullets. He said, if you have an innovations that are more likely to get adopted and scaled are those that have a relative advantage. The new thing is better than the old thing. I think hospital at home has that. It's observable, so you can see the new thing at work. I'm hoping some of those dots on the map that I showed you before give some of that observability. Still an issue. Complexity. So if an innovation is very complex, that's a downer for innovation scaling. And I would say hospital at home is complex. It's not a simple thing. It also has to be trialable, an innovation. So if you can try it at relatively little cost to you, you're more likely to adopt it. And then it has to be compatible with the culture and the ethos. So I would say hospital at home, good on relative advantage, getting better on observability. These three things have been tough for hospital at home. And I think part of the issue is just the way, not just health systems, but the way any culture thinks about change. So if any of you ever seen the video on the backward bicycle, please, 3 minutes, go see it later. I'll tell you about it. So a guy has an engineer build him a bicycle that does backwards things. You turn the steering handle to the right, the wheel goes to the left. And if I said to any of you, how long do you think it would take you to learn to ride that backward bicycle? Like, when I first saw the video, I could probably do that in about, an hour, maybe a day. It took this guy 8 months to learn how to do that. And he uses it as a metaphor for the difference between knowing you have to change and do something different. Right? He knew that this was a different bicycle. He knew he was going to have to do something different. But he did not know how to do that. And it gets to the issue of things just being so hardwired within health systems, within companies, within any sort of enterprise, that real change is really, really hard. It took him 8 months to learn the bicycle. It took his 10-year-old son about a week. And then the funny part of the video, he goes to Amsterdam with the idea of getting on a real bicycle again. Any of you ever been to Amsterdam? A lot of bicycles in Amsterdam. So he gets on the bicycle and he falls off that bicycle now. But it only took him about 2 hours to get back on a regular bicycle. And the reason I have Kodak up here, probably the young people don't even know what Kodak was. But it's an interesting story, and you might say, wow, Kodak kind of missed the boat on digital technology. They totally blew it, right? Kodak, for the young people, they made this thing called film, right? And you would get a little thing, and you would either take it into a place and get it developed, or you would send it away in an envelope, and you get your pictures back in the mail. But Kodak actually did a lot of work developing digital technology, investing in digital technology. But the interesting thing is they wanted to market digital technology as a means to get people to print out pictures. They didn't understand that the new technology had a completely different use case. And that's not unusual. I mean, you see it, you guys are living in the car capital of the world, right? When the first cars came along, what did they call them? Horseless carriages. And the reason the mindset was still horse, right? When steel came along to replace iron, the designs for bridges, they still use the same designs as they use for iron bridges, instead of designing new designs where they could use a quarter of the metal. So we tend to carry things over. I think that's where we are with healthcare today. We are still very stuck, in general, in a facility-based mindset. And it's hard to change. Everything from the ridiculously simple thing like the Excel sheets that your financial analysis people use to evaluate new opportunities. We had a situation in Hopkins. We were trying to move our home-based primary care program from our academic division to our health system. That took about 4 years and like 3,000 meetings, because our bureaucracy is something of a cross between the Department of Defense and the Vatican, right? It just takes a while to get things to move. But one of the obstacles was that on the financial evaluation form, there was no line in that form for projected savings. Those are the kinds of obstacles. In any event, we've been working on the payment issue. So something that came out of the macro legislation was the ability to petition Health and Human Services for new payment models, something called the PTAC, the Physician-Focused Payment Model Technical Advisory Committee to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I did that all in one breath. So we put in a new payment model application for hospital at home, 30-day bundled payment. It was the first one that was unanimously approved by the PTAC. It went to Tom Price's desk. And you remember Tom Price? Yeah, first-class flights, got kicked out. So it sat on his desk for a while. He gets kicked out. Sat on Ken Azar's desk for a while. Many more applications accumulated on his desk. And then he dissed all of them. However, we think there's reason to think that there will be payment reform coming, quote-unquote, soon. I don't know exactly when that is, but I would bet sometime within the next year or two. And not just for hospital at home, but for mechanisms that allow for new payment approaches for taking care of people with complex chronic illness and serious illness and end-of-life care. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. The other big thing that hospital at home has to take on is what I'll call supply chain. Does anyone know where this picture was taken? Yeah, New York, specifically. This is Times Square in a snowstorm. Have any of you lived in New York? Right, so what is this? Who is this guy? What's he doing? He's delivering food because no one in New York cooks. Right, everyone orders out, many people order out all their dinners. And I would say that supply chain to get Chinese food to someone's apartment is still infinitely better than the supply chain that hospital at home needs to survive. Right? You're up on the hospital floor, you order an antibiotic, There is a whole host of systems and operations that gets that antibiotic up to the floor in a reasonable time, and there's chuckling in the back. Maybe it doesn't happen quite as quick as you'd like. Right? There's a post-acute supply chain, operates at a different tempo. But hospital at home is going to need a hardened, redundant supply chain to make this happen. I should be able to be at someone's house, order ceftriaxone IV, and that's going to come by drone. 10 minutes later, you're laughing. That will absolutely happen. I can guarantee that. Amazon is looking at all these things right now. It's going to happen. It's absolutely going to happen. But it really needs to happen to have a safe model. And then you can get leadership and culture change. So this is a full-page ad in the New York Times from Mount Sinai. If our beds are filled, it means we failed. And they talked about a number of things they were doing to accomplish this. And one of the things they mentioned is the hospital at home. And I would say, and my colleagues at Sinai might say, that when this first hit the paper, this was really marketing. But over time, Sinai has they've drunk the Kool-Aid. And they are now reducing their inpatient bed footprint in New York City. So one of the hospitals in their system was the Beth Israel Hospital, 21st and 2nd, 3rd Avenue. That was a 900-bed hospital. It was getting old. They tore it down. They replaced 900 beds with 300 or 400 beds. Hospital at home is one of the strategies that they're using to make that real, along with home-based primary care and a whole lot of other kinds of things that they're doing. So leadership really does matter. A place where it has worked is Australia. So in Victoria State, Australia, where the city of Melbourne is, in the mid-90s, the health authority decided to pay the same rates for hospital at home care that they pay for hospital care. And now about 5 or 6% of all bed days in Victoria are hospital at home bed days. And this is a report from their health authority that says, but for doing that, they would have to have built another 500-bed hospital. You know how much it costs to capitalize a hospital bed? Right. So in California, that's $5 million because you have to have earthquake-proof beds. Here, it's probably about $2 million. In Baltimore, it's about $2 million. So that's $1 billion saving. That's societal return on investment. That's $1 billion that does not have to go into the building and into all the fixed costs to maintain that building. Because once you build the building, you have to feed that beast, right? So, I'm a health services researcher. A whole lot more research that needs to be done on this. Need to make sure it's good, need to make sure it's safe. But I do believe home-based medical care will be mainstreamed, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks for being so lovely.
Open up for questions. You can speak up.
The hospital at home model seems to exclude the homeless, which are an extremely vulnerable population. And some hospitals, I think, are experimenting with providing homes to the homeless who are frequent healthcare utilizers. Is there a way to sort of blend that into your model, take homeless patients that are frequent ER visitors, provide them a home in a hospital at home?
So the question is, how can you apply hospital at home to folks who are homeless and don't have a home? That can absolutely be done, and there have been, I don't know the details, but I do know that there have been some people thinking about and probably playing with, say, using hotel rooms as a hospital at home bed experience. So I think that is being done in some places. I don't know exactly where, but that is a thinking. I think it's a great point.
Julie.
Dr. Bynum.
Thank you, Bruce. Wonderful as always. I'd like just to thank you for shaping the rest of my career by inculcating some of these ideas in me very, very early in my career. But my question, as I come out of the Dartmouth world where we think about variation in care and how care is different in so many different places, can you speak a little bit more to what kind of cultures or communities or healthcare communities that are embracing this more rapidly than others?
So which communities are better suited? Is that...
I'm more interested in the culture change aspect to it.
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that. I think you need a culture of innovation. I think a culture that has an ethic of primary care is very helpful in this regard. I think actually non-academic medical centers are better in this kind of regard. Health systems that are more community-based, that feel just a little closer to their people. And that's not saying that you guys don't take that the wrong way. And I know you love your patients and all of that, but we in Baltimore, we at Hopkins, we're in, we are, this is Lourdes, and this is where people come to pray at the healthcare God, and we're kind of a mecca of sorts. Not that we always get it right, but I think that kind of culture and that kind of mentality, it's just a harder fit, where most of the providers and most of the units are just so many steps removed from the community. So I think those are some of the features. And in terms of the variation, and actually something I need to talk with you about later, the notion of we have great data on hospitals. We have pretty darn good data on nursing homes because you have the minimum data set. You have good data on what happens in primary care settings. There's really a relatively significant dearth of data on what happens in the community. So we're actually trying to figure out, can we build a Dartmouth Atlas kind of thing for community-based care? Because seeing that kind of variation and what those outcomes look like associated with different, that is just virgin prairie. That's a black box right now. And we need that for healthcare planning and delivery.
If the dominant force for most healthcare systems is the bottom line, profit, and if this is going to have such poor returns in terms of money, where do you see this going?
So a few things. Number one, a lot of the patients that could be taken care of in many of the existing versions of the model are actually patients that I think you here and us at Hopkins actually lose money on. These are not transplants. These are not joint. These are negative margin or barely scratching the surface of profitability kinds of patients for the most part. So you can make an argument to a chief financial officer, often unsuccessfully, that if you support this kind of program, then what you actually can do is increase bed capacity without spending $2 or $5 million per bed, without the fixed cost of maintaining that infrastructure. And you can actually put a higher profit DRG patient in that bed that otherwise would have been occupied by a loss leader for you. The reason the argument doesn't go too far is because, any CFOs in the audience? No. Is that CFOs don't believe in backfill. They only believe in business they can book. That's my experience. And I love CFOs. They're wonderful people, and I love them. But, so I think it's also, remember, sustainable trends at some point do become unsustainable. Like, I don't know when the U.S. healthcare system is finally going to wake up and say, we can't keep doing this anymore. But I think in the future what you'll see, and again, I don't know what that lag is, places like this will become, the hospital of the future will be an emergency room, ORs, and ICUs. I think most other stuff will get pushed out. And we've seen examples of that, right? We used to have psychiatric hospitals. Where'd they go? Gone. Done. I can remember visiting my great aunt at New York Eye and Ear in the early 70s, actually no, the late 60s, when she had a cataract done. She stayed in the hospital for a week with sandbags over her eyes because they didn't even know about REM sleep. They didn't want her to move her eyes, right? I mean, we were so stupid. I mean, we were just ridiculous. So things can change. When I was a house officer, everyone who got a cath got admitted, right? You now have a lot of joints that are being done in ambulatory surgery units and then going directly home. So things can change. I think economics is an amazing driver, and I think over time those economics will become unsustainable. And as the health systems evolve, they're going to move in this direction. We'll see.
We'll take one last question.
I'm not a physician, but I would suggest that your chart could show how the improvement of home care would prevent hospital-acquired infections like MRSA, et cetera. It would
Yes.
seem to me that, in the days of Ignaz Semmelweis, the women learned to have their babies out in the gutter instead of in the hospital because of the way the physicians would do autopsies, et cetera. So I think it's a big deal to do hospital work at home and not get MRSA.
So thank you for that comment, and it's embedded in there. I didn't have a chance to unpack that, but that is absolutely a benefit, is not being exposed to this great petri dish, right? And so for instance, Mass General is now working with one of the commercial entrants in the field to do a lot of oncologic care at home. At Duke, they're doing a lot of bone marrow transplant in hospital at home. And Semmelweis never did him. He was not a nice man. He didn't do. That's why a lot of people didn't like him. So.
Well, Bruce, I want to thank you for a wonderful discussion and talk. I do want to say, I want to ask, the backward bicycle guy, did he infer at home or did he go to the hospital multiple times?
I'm sorry.
The backwards bicycle guy.
Yeah.
Did he infer at home?
No. He just kept falling.
Okay. Well, thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.